Thank you, Brother Chairman. Dear brothers and sisters online, our dear young people, ladies and gentlemen, and to anybody who watches this online, welcome. In this series of 4 talks, we're going to be looking at God's witness in regards to his people, the nation of Israel. We know that they've been brought back to the land. We can see them there today, but tonight we're going to deal with World War I and how all the process began for that to happen. And what we're going to be asking of you to believe is that in the first 2 lines of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And we're going to ask you to believe that that's World War I. Now, there's no names of countries, there's no names of time periods, there's nothing to go by to single that as World War I. We're then going to ask you to believe that in between the words him and the, that from 1917 up until today, that's where we are in the scriptures at the moment. And in the near future, we shall see the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots. And generally when you look at verses like this, some of the first things that people might mention is, well, they don't make chariots anymore. So a chariot in the ancient times was the most feared weapon on the battlefield. It was mobile. The soldier was encased in a layer of armor, so his projectile weapon could be used. Mobile, armored warfare. And we believe that the king of the north is Russia. And just recently, when we've seen the Russians invade the country of Ukraine, this is CCTV footage from the morning that the Russians crossed the border. As you can see, it's just soldiers encased in armor, which are mobile with projectile weapons. That's exactly what that verse is talking about. Armored mobile warfare. And the soldiers themselves, they're inside these vehicles here. There'll be about 4 or 5 of them on each side. So coming back to Daniel 11 at verse 40, the first clue that we're given is a time period. It's a generalization at the time of the end. There are phrases in scriptures which say, in the latter days, which is referring to a smaller period of time, very, very close to the return of Christ. But this time period is much more generalized, which could include a time period. The next clues we're given is that there is a king of the south and a king of the north. But we're not told who they are or where they are. So that's what we're going to be determining tonight. Now, when I look at prophecy, my basic process that I go through is whatever thought I have, you always start with a foundation, work your way back up, and if your thought doesn't fit, discard it. And the very basics of prophecy are found in the book of Daniel. If you want to come to learn about God's prophecies, how they're going to work, always start with the book of Daniel. That is your foundation. Understand the book of Daniel first. The other prophecies will start falling into place for you. And the very foundation of the book of Daniel is chapter 2, where the king of Babylon is given an image of 5 different forms of ever-decreasing metals, ending with a 5th element of clay within the feet. And we believe each of these 5 different elements represent a different empire through the time period of humanity. Now, Daniel's prayer is answered, and he gives an interpretation as to what's actually being said. And when Daniel speaks to the king of Babylon, he says that thou art a king of kings. So we're dealing with royal authority in the governing of a country over all other authorities. It is then confirmed that the God of heaven has established the king of Babylon and has given him this power to be able to do so. He says further on in the verse that the reason for this, that he's made him ruler over all men, beasts and fowls. So he has complete authority. What he says happens. If he changes the law 5 minutes later, that's the new law. There's no stopping it. He can change it back 5 minutes later again. It's a king's authority. The people can't change that. And Daniel, right at the very end, straight out says that thou art this head of gold. So we know that the image is a reflection of a kingdom in the time period of the history of men. But he then goes on to say to the king of Babylon that after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. So we know that as we go down the statue, a monarchy system where what's said is law changes into a different form of a governmental system where the king's authority isn't as powerful no more. And in Scripture we read about this, because during the times of the Medes and Persians, when a law was passed, the king didn't have the authority to change it. And people who didn't have a royal authority used that against the king to force him to cause Daniel to go into the den of the lions, which thankfully the God of heaven delivered Daniel out of. So we see that it's a lessening form of authority of a monarchical system that people are governing by. Now later in Daniel's life he has another dream. On one side of the river there's a ram with two horns, and on the other side of the river there's a goat with a prominent horn. And Daniel says, when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, that's the type of mind frame that God's looking for in people. Someone who takes the time and effort to consider what's being said. You don't rush an answer. You seek for it. You wait and you allow God to have time to give you the answer for it. He goes on to say, then behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So we know the interpretation we're going to be given is from a divine source. So it's one that just can't be argued against. And Gabriel says that the ram, that is the kings of the Media and Persia, and the goat, that is the king of Grecia. So once again, we're told two subsequent empires. So the image, ever declining in its quality as you go down the image, is corresponding to different empires through the history of men. But in the image made up of these metals and the clay, all of these elements come out of the clay and the soil in the first place. God takes them out of the soil. It's where humankind comes from dust thou art. All of these rulers that God puts in place over these different empires have come out of the soil from where we come from. It's God that has established them into their position. Now we know from history when we go through school that the empire which followed the Grecian Empire was the Roman Empire, and that is represented by legs of iron, two separate items, two individual pieces of iron. And then when we come down to the feet, it becomes unusual because there's the two elements here. One's a metallic and one's clay, and the two things don't go together. It's unstable. And the entire image, that is the foundation on which the entire image is standing upon, an unstable form of government that can't last. Whereas in Daniel 2 he says, whereas thou sawest iron mixed with clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave to one another. So who is they that Daniel's talking about? In the following verse he tells us that in the days of these kings, so once more he's referring back to a monarchical system. And as we see from the image itself, as the king's authority to govern the land is being reduced, as each empire of mankind has progressed down, we come to the very end of the image where a monarchical authority is literally reduced to not being able to have any effect at all. In fact, today, the only monarchical system we have in the Western world is we're seeing it on the TV. He's just got pronounced King Charles III. And the actual power he has left is pretty nominal because the people vote in the government and then the government has their say. And if the Queen had turned around and said to the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, no, I don't want you as Prime Minister, she would have just gone back to Westminster and they would have changed the law and she would have still been Prime Minister anyway. And the Queen would have had no power to change anything. So the power of a king, a monarchical system, has been reduced down to a foundational form of government which has no chance of being able to hold up whatsoever. And the end of the images, as we know from Daniel chapter 2, is that a stone is going to crash into the feet. Thou sawest till the stone was cut out without hands, which means it's not going to be done by the work of men's hands. It's going to be done by a divine source, which smote the image upon the feet that were iron and clay and break them to pieces. You can't break clay to pieces. It's a soft, malleable, you can squash it around in your fingers. To break clay to pieces, it's got to pass through fire. And the fire is what makes it brittle so that you can then break the clay into pieces. And fire in scriptures is always spiritually representing judgment. And the one instance I use to express that is in the 1 Peter chapter 1, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than that of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honour and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. So we're given a time period that once Jesus Christ returns back to the earth and appears to it, that the clay is going to pass through a judgment of fire. It will then become brittle, and it's Jesus Christ who then break down that image and those weakening form of governments. Because we know that Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. It's not the king of Babylon who's the true king of kings, because his form of government got heavily decreased down to the point of no authority. The true king of kings is going to return when Christ returns. And he's the one who will turn the clay into a substance that can be broken down, where all those forms of governments are going to be driven away like chaff, and a true and a righteous monarchical system will be put into place on the earth. So getting back to the dream that Daniel had, we know that the goat is the king of Grecia. In chapter 8, Gabriel gave us the interpretation that the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So when we look at the Greek Empire, we know that Alexander's father, the king of Macedon, ruled in this general area, and I'll do it very vaguely because that's about a 2,500 year argument that won't go away. But the Greek Empire only lasted 13 years. Alexander the Great stormed his way from this area of the world all the way across to the borders of China and India within 13 years and established this empire. He lived a debaucherous life, drunkenness, same-sex relationships, died at the age of 33. He left 3 heirs. One was a half-brother, sadly suffered of mental health issues. He had a son who was born after he died, and he had another family member who was distant. Within a year, those 3 heirs had been killed. The 4 generals which served under him come to the decision that they would split his empire up between them. And in Gabriel's interpretation, it tells us that when that great horn gets broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up. And we know from history that what those 4 kingdoms are. And like everybody would love to do, they'd love to give themselves a promotion. So these 4 generals turned into 4 kings. And just ironically, had a coincidence, there is an actual genuine creature that has 4 horns, but it's a sheep. It's not a goat. So it's scripture, the Hebrew requires a goat, but it's ironic that 2 of those horns are more prominent than the other 2 horns. So we come back to the image. It's a goat, which got 4 horns, which we know became the 4 different kingdoms that Alexander the Great's empire got split into. And what that gives us is it gives us who the king of the south is now. We know where that area of the land is. And it gives us a king of the north. Now we know where that area of the land is as well. So when we come back to Daniel 11, now we're given places, people. Now we just got to sort out a time period. Now the king of the south, pretty much their kingdom remained from the time that it got split until even after the Romans conquered it, right the way down to the last ruler was Cleopatra. She was the last Ptolemaic leader, about 30 years before Christ was born. And they pretty much ruled from Alexandria. Alexandria is the place where the kingdom, the throne started, and it generally remained in the area. When we quickly come back to the image, we know that when those four kingdoms were split, we're waiting to see the next kingdom, which we all learnt at school, which is the Roman Empire, which, remember, is two distinct legs, separate from each other. So when we come back to Gabriel's interpretation of the dream, he goes on to say, the great horn was broken, and then came up four notable ones. We've seen which four kingdoms they are. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great. And then from the image, we know that that little horn is the Roman Empire. So we're just going to see how that little horn grew. So this is a quick history of the Roman Empire. And you'll see the little horn right there. And it becomes exceedingly great. So through God's will, because he takes from the soil of the earth and establishes who he wants in power, you see how the Roman Empire grows through time. But remember in the image that there are two legs to the statue. So now we see two individual parts of the image. You've got one capital here in Rome and another capital here in Constantinople. And that capital there, which we believe is where the King of the North ends up from, just look how it's held on to as the last remnant of that image declines down. They're just coming basically back down. They're just trying to defend the Constantinople until eventually it's gone. So, King of the South, we know ruled from Alexandria, even though it was conquered by the Romans. And the last remnant of that Roman Empire finished in Constantinople, where the King of the North, we now believe. So we know the two kingdoms, we know where their thrones were. Now we've got to sort out the time period. In 1922, Egypt became independent. So what we've got to do is look to the history books. From 1922 until today, has Egypt ever attacked Constantinople? No. Who governed Egypt before they became independent? Well, from 1882 to 1922, it was the British. Has Britain ever tried to attack Constantinople? Well, we know, yes, they have. Because in World War I, the Gallipoli landings was for the purpose of taking Constantinople. So we have one time where that could happen, where it's happened. So we'll keep going. Before the British, 1805 to 1882, the Ottoman general Muhammad Ali formed his own dynasty in Egypt. Now he went to war with the Ottoman Empire twice, and his armies did advance up into the Anatolia area here, but the European powers told him to take his forces back to Egypt or suffer the consequences. So he retreated back to his land. So even though he had successes, he never actually formed an attack against Constantinople. Before him were the French, 1798 to 1805. They stayed down in the south of the Mediterranean. They were surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. The French were there very long. Preceding the French, you've got the Ottoman Empire itself. 1517, 1798, they governed all of that area. And I'm pretty certain that they didn't try to attack themselves in Constantinople, so that one's safe. And before them, you had the Mamluk Empire from 1250 to 1570, and they didn't try to attack Constantinople. So we're left with one instance from the year 1250 to today. There was only one occurrence of someone who was governing the area of the King of the South attacking that last city of Constantinople of the King of the North. There's only once where it happened. So we can be absolutely certain that when we go back to that Daniel 11:40, that when he says the King of the South pushes at the King of the North, we know that it's this circumstance that we're looking at. But there is somewhere else in Scripture which helps support the idea. If you want to turn up Isaiah 43. Now in Isaiah 43 it says, "But now thus saith the Yahweh that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee. O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee." And the next line is one I really believe that should be given a lot of deep thought to, especially in regards to what we've been talking about. "When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." It always brings up memories of Daniel's friends in the furnace. The fire was just unable to take a hold upon them during the judgment. "For I am Yahweh thy God, the Holy One of Israel, thy Saviour. I gave Egypt for thy ransom, Ethiopia and Seba for thee. Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honourable, and I have loved thee. Therefore will I give men for thee and people for thy name. Fear not, for I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth." So now we're given a little bit more of a clue that in the time period when we begin to see God's children being brought back from the ends of the earth, we know that the nation of Egypt is going to be given for that sake. But God says that he will call them by their name, and they wasn't called by their name until the year 1948, when the name of Israel was given back to them. The land itself was given to them in 1947, when the United Nations had already held the vote to give them their homeland back. But the naming of the people was given in 48. But there's only one problem. In 1914, the Holy Land was still occupied by the Ottoman Empire. And so we come to World War I. It was a time period where people believed it was glorious to fight wars. People were heroes. If you could kill people in the millions, you were given honours and medals and promoted. It's an awful way to think. This is the Smith family. She had 7 sons. These 6 didn't come home. This is the town of Durham in Great Britain. 8% of their population didn't come home. We all know the Western Front. 4 years fighting over a purple line. 5 million men died trying to work their way to the other side of that purple line. That's what humanity calls glorious. And so because of the stalemate, the First Lord of the Admiralty had an idea to open up a second front. That second front was to attack Constantinople. There's a documentary called Gallipoli from Above. It was narrated by this man, Hugh Dolan. He was a British intelligence officer. His father fought in Gallipoli. One day someone put a map on his desk, and he immediately recognised it as the Dardanelles. And he was looking over the map, and you can see the machine gun places, you can see where the artillery was, where all the barbed wire was, you could see all the defences. And he looked in the bottom right-hand corner, and he'd seen the date, and the date of the map was 3 days before the landings. And he thought, well, why was it such a massacre if they knew where all the defences was? It doesn't make sense. So because he was an intelligence officer, he started doing a bit of investigations. And what he basically discovered was what you wouldn't have expected to have gone wrong, went wrong. So we're going to see a little bit more of how God prepared the way to begin bringing the children of Israel back into the land in accordance to his will. So the story is the British ambassador in Constantinople, as most British men do, like ships or trains or planes. And so at lunchtime he used to go down to the Dardanelles and watch the shipping go by. So while he was watching the shipping go by, there was this little ship in the Turkish Navy. All the Turkish warships had been taken into the Black Sea for safety. And he was listening to the Turkish officers with German accents, just organising the ship and sending it out, and he was watching what he was doing. And what this little ship was doing was, it was just laying minefields across the Dardanelles. Because the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, before Britain had even declared war on Turkey, Turkey had begun to attack the Russians. And before Britain made a declaration of war, Churchill decided to send 4 warships up into this area of the Dardanelles and start attacking the Turkish defences before the government had even declared war. They came back. It then got reported that the Turks were starting to put more defences in there, so we sent 2 destroyers in. They came back with a report that you're not going to get rid of those guns unless they're hit directly. And it was no secret what was going to happen, because out on the Isle of Lemnos is where the British and French fleets were gathering with all the troops. So the mistake that happened was, if Churchill hadn't sent those warships in there, when the first attack happened of sending a fleet straight up to Constantinople to force the Turks to surrender, there would hardly been any defences in their way. But because he took events into his own hands and initiated an attack before his country had even declared war, it caused the Turks to start building defences, which this tiny little ship, the Nusret, and all of its capabilities took on the 16 battleships that were going to get sent into the Dardanelles to Constantinople. And by the end of the day, 3 of those battleships were sunk, 3 more were put out of commission. That's a disaster. 6 battleships taken out in one day, all because of the effects of this little ship. The Turks love this ship. It's still in commission today. They just keep it running. You can go on tours on this ship around the Bosphorus Straits. That's how much that they love what this ship achieved and managed to do. So because the fleet had failed in its bringing Turkey to a surrender, the plan B was to land troops at Gallipoli. Now this is a beautiful point. The troops who were planning and preparing to go to Lemnos for the landings at Gallipoli to go and attack Constantinople, give you one guess where they were training and preparing for that landing. Alexandria. Straight from the capital of the King of the South. That's where the troops were prepared from. So when Scripture is talking about the King of the South shall push at him, push at the King of the North, the troops that were going to do that came out of the capital of the King of the South itself. It was one direct place going for the other direct place. Phenomenal. So the landings took place in Gallipoli. And what normally wouldn't have gone wrong was going wrong. I'll just give you a couple of examples. On one of these 2 ridges here, what the British had planned, they got a ship, filled it with 2,000 troops. They've just got to run it aground, open the doors, let the troops run out, storm over the top of the Turkish defenders, form a good bridgehead. What went wrong is the guy who was steering the boat ran it aground on rocks about 100, 150 metres away from the beach. They opened the doors right in front of a machine gun nest. 1,500 of those troops were killed within minutes. The only reason why the other 500 survived is because they refused to get out of the boat. So they stayed there until they were rescued. The Aussies were landed up here on these beaches. It's normally considered that the British were bunglers, but the only thing the British did in regards to the Anzacs was they told them what beaches they were going to land at. And they weren't giving them any more orders than that. The Anzacs commanded themselves. The guy who's in charge of the Anzacs at the time, he used to fly in a plane all over the peninsula taking photographs, which is how they made the map in the first place. He wasn't a klutz. When he got back to his ship, his HQ, which is out somewhere out here in the water, he was the first general to start making 3D models of the beaches he was going to be invading. by no means was he a bad general. He was very gifted. And some of the examples that was happening, which don't normally happen, is the Allied troops would move through a town. And one example was they didn't leave any troops behind to garrison it. So the Turks just came back into it as soon as they left. Then they were given the order to go back and take that town, and it cost the lives of 6,000 men in doing so. When you look at the topography of the peninsula here, the Anzacs were landing around on these beaches, British and French down here. From here to here, you basically have 4 ridges. If you take all 4 ridges, you're standing around here, and you can see over the top of these waters. You can take out all the defensive guns in this area, you can start clearing the mines, and the ships can just come right the way through. The Anzacs took 3 of these 4 ridges. They weren't penned in on the beaches and couldn't get off the beaches. They were there for 8 months. The Anzacs moved across 3 of those 4 ridges, and then something stopped them. The commanders decided not to try and take the 4th ridge. If they'd taken the 4th ridge, all the Turkish troops here would have been cut off. They would have to have surrendered, and the entire British and French forces could have met up with the Anzacs, and all of them could have gone straight up to Constantinople. What they didn't find out until after the war was the Turkish defenders on the last ridge got no ammunition. One man in a gun could have walked over there and taken it, but something stopped them from doing so. What shouldn't have gone wrong was going wrong. So it finally came time after 8 months, so they decided to leave. The problem with the leaving is, when you were drawing men from the bridges, from the beaches, you got your enemy on the ridges are going to be shooting them, and it was expected to have been a massacre to get the troops off the beach. But in trying to push from the king in the south up to the king in the north here was in the wrong place, which is why it wasn't working. But when the decision came to evacuate, all the situations that shouldn't have been going wrong, that was going wrong, changed. And the idea that they employed was this little mechanism. A small amount of men remained behind, using these rifles up over the top of the trenches just to fire off shots at the Turks, just to keep their heads down. When night fell, the main amount of armies left, got down to the beaches, onto boats, left, brought the boats back. When they brought the boats back, these rifles were tied with strings and ropes with candles underneath, so they're on timers, so they would automatically just be firing off a shot, and the remaining men left down the beaches on the boats, evacuated. In the morning, the Turks found out that all the Allied troops had gone. And the fortunes had completely flipped, because not a single soldier died in the evacuation. Whereas everything before that was bungling and going wrong, 6 battleships getting taken out of commission, what should have been a massacre also changed to not a single loss of life. So they evacuated. Came back down here to the area of the King of the South, but the Turks were still in the Holy Land. So now it came time to remove them. A British officer, T. Lawrence, when he was going through college, his professor sent him to the Middle East, told him to walk around, take lots of photographs. He estimated he walked about 1,000 kilometres, wore out a pair of boots, went back to Cambridge, did his thesis, got tremendous accolades for his thesis, left college. His professor told him to go back to the Middle East. So he went to Gilgamesh, started helping with the archaeological stuff in Gilgamesh, got put in charge over the locals, so we learned how they work, how they talk, what they like, what they don't like, got to know who the people are. So when the times of the Arab uprising began in World War I, we came to know him as Lawrence of Arabia. So now we're talking about how fortunes change. How now that the King of the South is now going to push the Turks out of the land in preparation for the turn of the children of Israel. Now, in the southern parts of Arabia, the Arabs are starting to band together to fight the Turkish occupation. Now, this is real footage of the Arab uprising. Here you got Faisal, which was the son of the king. Standing here, you got Lawrence of Arabia. The two got on very well. See, the problem was that the Arab uprising was taking place down here, and he was in Medina with 12,000 troops. The Arabs wanted to get rid of them from Medina, but Lawrence advised them not to. He says, if you get rid of the 12,000 troops, those 12,000 troops are going to reposition back here. He says, leave them there. We'll just harry them, harass them. We'll do enough to keep them there and keep them busy. We just take in the area. So the Arab uprising was taking areas around this part of the peninsula. What Lawrence of Arabia wanted was to take Aqaba. And Aqaba was deemed by the Allied forces as untakeable. We know that there's a desert in this area here. There's even a more harsh desert on this side of it here. It was deemed that you couldn't take an army across them. All the guns at Aqaba faced out to sea. You couldn't do an amphibious landing. It would be a slaughter. But Lawrence, in his characteristical ways, took Faisal to lead an army from Way, to take the army across a desert, which they said you can't take an army across, in the hope of being able to take a city which the Allies deemed that you couldn't take. And this is the type of terrain that they took about 500-600 men across. Absolutely barren. And for 600 miles, this army went undetected by the Turks. They had no idea that it was there, that it had been moving through its empire, and that eventually it got round the back of Aqaba. And that's the final ridge that the Lawrence and the Arab army came across. There's Aqaba down in there. And you've all probably watched this movie. But the Turks' defences in Aqaba was completely taken by surprise. The Arab army came storming into the back. All the guns were facing the wrong way. So they had no defences for the army that was charging into their city. It was described that the Turks put off a few shots at them and then just turned and fled. But like most Hollywood movies, it's not very accurate. The truth of this charge is Lawrence shot his pistol twice, then accidentally shot his camel in the back of the head, which fell down. He somersaulted, knocked him out, and he didn't have a clue that Aqaba had fallen until he had regained consciousness afterwards. That was the truth of the situation. So here is a real photo of the day that Aqaba fell. But at the same time, you'd got the British army pushing up into Palestine, and we all know the story about Beersheba, but Beersheba itself has another unique story attached to it. We know that it fell to the charge of the Australian Light Horse, but the Australian Light Horse was an infantry unit. They just used horses to get to their position quickly, dismount, engage the enemy. If trouble started, they could get in the horses and get out quick. It was a rapid reaction unit. For the entirety of the day, the army which was attacking Beersheba was 60,000 strong. They'd been encircling the city to stop any Turkish reinforcements from getting in. They were down to 1 day's rations of water left. And the Australian commander approached the British and gave him an idea that why don't you just let the light horse charge all the way in? They had never used that tactic before. It was completely unique for that one situation. There was British cavalry there, about 12,000 cavalry. He was incensed that his cavalry wasn't going to be used for a charge. The argument the Australian commander put forth was, if you employ the British cavalry, they will set up the defences for British cavalry. If you deploy the light horse and just charge all the way in, the Turks will set up a defence for the light horsemen, expecting them to stop and dismount. And it won them over. So a completely unique battle tactic came to mind for the taking of Beersheba, and about 4 kilometres away, about somewhere up to about 20,000 light horse began their walk up over the ridge. The Turks saw the light horsemen coming in, set their defences ready to deal with the light horsemen dismounting. About 2.5 kilometres away, they started their gallop. Coming into where the Turkish artillery was, it was said that the British artillery found it within 2 shots, took out the Turkish artillery, protecting them. A machine gun post on the other side of that side of the city was taken out very quickly as well, and it left the field completely open. About 1.5 kilometres away, when they was expecting the light horsemen to dismount, they didn't. And the Turks realised that the Aussies had gone and gotten inside of their defences. When the Turkish defenders realised they were about to receive a full charge of about up to about 20,000 horses, most of them got out of their trenches and fled. Phenomenal. Which leaves us Jerusalem. In 1928, Major Vivian Gilbert wrote a book about how Jerusalem fell. In the book, he mentions a Private Merck. He was a cook. Describes him as a miserable specimen of a man. Cockney from London. Didn't like him at all. Got a hole in his boot. Irritated him because he mentions it a lot. Through the night, they hear a rooster crowing. So they send out the cook to see if they can see if there's chickens there as well to get some eggs for the officers. It's foggy night. As this cook's looking for eggs, a group of Turks in fezzes carrying a white flag come up to him and surrender the city of Jerusalem to him. In the book, he writes, Joubert says he was himself at battalion headquarters when Merck finally returned, hot and out of breath. The perspiring private proceeded to write his amazing adventures in a richly Cockney dialect, adds Gilbert. Once he had finished, the commanding officer turned and said, "Gentlemen, Jerusalem has fallen." Now, Private Merck's CO and Brigadier immediately set for Jerusalem to collect the keys to the city. And the first actual photo we got is 2 British CO. The guy at the back with the fez, with the white flag, is the mayor of Jerusalem. And so for the second time that morning, Jerusalem was surrendered to a member of the British Army. When the area commander heard that the Jerusalem had fallen, he sent a message back to the front line saying, "Take the keys back to Jerusalem. I want to come and receive the surrender of Jerusalem." So you'll find these pictures in the morning from the morning of when Jerusalem surrendered. Now you can see that they're in officers' uniforms. They're on horseback because they wanted to get there quick. So for the third time on the 9th of December, the city of Jerusalem surrendered to the British Army. Allenby was 2 days away in Egypt, which is why he arrived 2 days later on the 11th. And that's a picture we all see. They all talk about the surrender of Jerusalem on the 11th, but it didn't happen on the 11th. It happened on the 9th. 9th of December 1917 is 24th of Shivlev. And if you want to see a deep connection as to why the surrender of Jerusalem on the 9th of December has got a connection with the 24th of Shivlev, have a read of Haggai 2, because Haggai 2 happens on the 24th of Shivlev as well in regards to the city of Jerusalem. I don't think it's by any coincidence that that city, in preparation for the return of the children of Israel back to the establishment of the kingdom of God, happened on the exact same day as in regards to what Haggai 2 is saying. So we go back to the Western Front. 5 million men dead over a purple line. Gallipoli, 56,000 men dead. 123,598 wounded. Warfare is an awful thing. Whatever could go wrong was going wrong. The war to end all wars didn't end all wars because they're still fighting. But do we see God's hand at work here? The desert that they said you couldn't take an army across, and the city that they said that was you couldn't take, what was the loss of life to cross that desert with an army and to storm into that city? They lost 2 men. Charge of the light horse against artillery, machine guns, entrenched soldiers. They only lost 35. The entire day battles in surrounding Beersheba, they only lost 171. The city of Jerusalem has been attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, besieged 23 times and destroyed twice. You've got all the death from the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, or the revolts that the Roman Empire has put down, all of the internal strife. You've got 3 different crusades, you've got all the Arab armies and all the other horrendous stuff. It's probably the city in the world where the most bloodshed has been caused by warfare. Handing that city out of Muslim hands into a Christian army, how many people lost their life in the deliverance of that city into the Tarshish Pass? No one. That's the hand of God at work. The most fought over city in human history was handed, when the time was right, was handed into the king of the south with 0 loss of life. Reminds me of the story of Sennacherib, with Jerusalem surrounded by an army. And the next morning, the entire army's gone. That's magnificent. That's God's hand at work in preparation for bringing his children home. Phenomenal. Western Front, 5 million men. Taken of the most bloody city in the human history, 0. That's phenomenal. So we can see from Daniel 11 that the king of the south, when God wishes it to happen, was done and accomplished. We live in a time period now in between that and the king of the north. We know that the king of the north is Russia. We can see the stirrings of Russia where it's now in a frame of mentality where it doesn't want to deal with things over the negotiating table no more. It wants to start dealing with things through warfare. It's not working their way at the moment because the time isn't right for the Russians to take Constantinople and become the king of the north. When it does so, we know it's going to dive straight down the coast. And if you noticed in the chapter that we read that when he dives straight down the coast, the area of Egypt is no longer referred to as the king of the south, it's just simply called Egypt. Because the role of the king of the south will be finished, because as soon as Christ returns, all of those failing empires that humanity has tried to do through time will just come to an end. We'll have a divine ruler, a true king of kings. No one will usurp his authority. His laws and his decrees will be righteousness. What those laws and decrees will be, you can join us on another night and other people will explain to you what they are. May the God of heaven be with you. May he open your eyes to his truth. May he keep you safe until we can bring his truth to you.